Seth, oh my goodness, Seth, how are you, my friend? You doing all right?
The stars aligned. My client canceled. Well,
Oh
as
my
according to
goodness.
them, basically the session didn't have to happen, so here I am.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's delightful. Well, it is good to see you today, Seth. I really enjoyed our conversation, and your write-up was amazing. Javier, good to see you. Andrew, good to see you. This is Seth. Seth is awesome. We had a wonderful conversation on embodied knowledge. He does wonderful work on the body moves. I really enjoyed that, and I thought what you wrote up was really, really good. And I'm glad you also brought it was just a lovely discussion. And yeah, so much of just hearing my grandmother say that nobody gets married planning to get divorced was like, wait a minute, that means we can't trust the brain. Oh my gosh, there's a frenemy brain we have to work through. That was a lovely discussion. And it's actually quite, I'll have to show you this particular, if I can, this particular tree in front of the house is like really pretty this time of year.
Oh
Yeah, let me see if I can do this. I used to work as a photographer, so can I angle it right? Yeah, something like that. So that was quite delightful. But I've also, yeah, it's nice, Mr. Parsons. But I've been working on, I have a Theory Underground conference presentation tonight on Ivan Illich. And I have to unfold chairs for the wedding, so we'll see if we can get that done. I'm not sure. But I'm very taken by Ivan Illich. Seth, I think you'd like Mr. Illich. And one of the things he talks about, and I'm happy to talk about anything today, Mr. Rivera, I enjoyed your talk with Jock, and I started your talk with Luber, which I really was enjoying as well. So that's a cool series on God. And yeah, one of the things that's so interesting about Illich is this distinction between conviviality and manipulation, where what is the difference between a technology that helps us be better friends and a technology that manipulates us, like in an attentionless dynamic or something like that? And of course, nobody uses a technology planning to be manipulated by it. But that's, of course, exactly what a manipulated person thinks, right? Kind of like the grandmother example. Like so much of life is precisely a problem because if you knew you were doing the thing that was bad, you wouldn't be doing it. And that's why you're doing it. And so there's something about technology, like if we talk about just like no one apparently is addicted to their cell phones, right? Addiction to cell phone is what other people do. I have the right balance. Like everyone else is addicted to social media, but not me. And that, of course, is funny because I think you and your experience of social media always see your good reason for doing it and how you're just checking it for a second and you're not really paying. Well, actually, here, maybe getting to the body, like, how do your eyes feel at the end of the day? Are they really bothering you? That might be a censure on it too much. But not have it's funny because there's always like you experience your reason for using the technology. And so it's always rationalized. And Dimitri, good to see you, sir. And whereas what Ivan Illich is warning, it's like if you're not able to actually see like you're with everyone else kind of on an equal playing field, then you're likely to be manipulated versus use these technologies for conviviality. And by conviviality, kind of means friendship or to extend. I like to think of it as extending humanity versus replacing humanity. And I'll give it to Rivera here. Just to Luber, it is good to see you as well. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, it's good to see you today, sir.
Yeah, so the talk with Luber and I was really good. It finally clicked for me, even though I've been hearing you harp on this for a very long time. The economic situation. Um, because Luber and I were talking about what's the difference between the artist and the mystic. And right now, I've only been able to superficially give a demarcation, which is there's something about the artist that he's able to forget himself. But the risk is, and the mystic knows this risk at least, is that there's egoic traps. So there's a part of the artist that can become super egoic, where you can kind of initiate a kind of self-forgetting. I think this is actually why Nietzsche is really good at creativity, because there's actually a hyper egoic self-forgetting that you can kind of undergo, which is really strange to say. Um, but I think the fundamental traps are onegoic traps from the mystic that the mystic points out. Because the mystic kind of knows a kind of self-forgetting that is, I guess, more on the side of like virtue, um, and is not able to get captivated too much Um, so how do we link that to the economic system and conviviality and everything? Well, it has to do with attention, of course. Um, so this question of like the Christian, let's say the Christian paradigm, right? Like to be in the world and not of it. I've been really liking figures like Dorothy Day, who basically started off communist, then became Catholic, which is a very interesting switch. But she's kind of like, if the blessed are the poor, why do we assume that they have to remain that way? And I actually think the communist vision is actually the biggest Christian ideal of being in the world but not of the world, right? So there's a lot of stressors that we have that are, in my opinion, superfluous. They don't have to be there. But they cultivate our attention the entire time. Because the world tells us that we have to pay attention to it. So that means I have to worry about having a good job. I have to worry about paying my rent. I have to worry about maintaining a certain amount of hours. I have to worry about medical bills. I have to worry about my children's future, intuition, and everything. These all split the attention. And the world is telling you that you have to care about these things. In the poverty-esque commons economic system, it's saying, if this was taken care of, what would you pay attention to? Or what could be available for you to pay attention to? And I think this is actually the mystical question, is what could you pay attention to if all of these worries were stripping away from? And it's really clicked for me, Daniel, on like why the economic question is so important, because fundamentally, even though we could talk about, oh, everybody needs to go on this mystical, contemplative, bodily like path, some of us could do that, but it would be a privilege, right? It would have to be a privilege kind of setting. Like not everybody can just do monkhoods and monasteries and so on. So it does require an economic change system, and it would be something like a commons. And I think that's when we would begin, at least the very least, begin the potential of an artist mystique, a mystic social society. I think that's the only beginning that is possible, actually, for that potential. Yeah. So those are my initial thoughts right there.
Lovely, and I'll pass it to Philip. Yeah, there's a bunch of things. A question that comes to mind: can one do friendship without mysticism? Can one maintain awareness without something like the mystical vision? Does one actually understand economics if they lose sight that it's a fundamental kind of theology? Really, it's a kind of organizing by principles that are not. The moment you talk about value, what? Oh, it's the wind. It comes and goes, right? Also, attention is so fascinating because there's no doubt that pricing mechanisms are metaphysical, maybe with the META in parentheses, but it's a coordination of attention, right? Like it's a coordination of action. It is a coordination ultimately of a body, right? To allude to Seth's work. And it's interesting because when we talk about like one of the great mystical visions, like when you talk about worry, obviously Matthew 6 with Jesus, what does that famous verse say? Look at the birds of the air, as we love. Look at them. Have you ever actually looked at them? Look at the flowers. Look at the lilies. Solomon in all of his glory. What? Greater than Solomon in all of his glory? And now you're telling me they're being thrown into fire? What are you doing? But look at them. Have you ever looked at them? Or have you ever just sought the status of Solomon without ever seeing glory, right? Well, there's something very interesting about that, because then if you're so PMC, time-fractured mass that you don't have, you're like, yeah, Jesus, I'd like to look at the lilies, but I'm really distracted by my phone, and I've lost the ability to have attention. And I'm so disembodied that I don't even know how to use my eyes anymore, and I'm tired, right? It is funny that if there is something radically mystical about that particular verse in Matthew, which I'm thinking about as you speak, because it is a blending of the mystical, the economic, the bodily, the seeing, the artistic, all together. And it is basically like, do not worry about your life, what you will drink, what you will eat. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor weep and store up in barns, and yet your heavenly Father takes care of them. That's pretty weird. That's pretty weird. Are you telling me that if I actually saw reality correctly, there would be some sort of a way to actually own these realities? Seems to be. But of course, Jesus is directly speaking to economic tensions, right? And of course, what has happened, if we take, you mentioned Marx with the, to organize society according to abstract social use in the beginning, what you're doing is actually, I now see that tree. Well, I now see this cup as worth $50. There's no $50 in reality. I see this according to that metaphysical principle, right? I have eyes within my eyes that I don't even know are there, which actually takes away my capacity to see the cup like a Cézanne painter, like to actually see what it is in its facticity. And something about the mystical vision and having new values and new self-forgetfulness and intrinsic motivation is tied to that. But this is why a social coordination mechanism that makes possible different ways of organizing is so important, because it has to ultimately lead, if you're going to talk about new economic models that don't fall into, say, previous meta judgments of the commodity form, then you have to organize socially differently. And I think that's what we're beginning to see with the liminal web as some kind of thoughts. Because also, too, if I say, hey, yeah, and I'll give it to Philip here, there's a lot of benefits to taking walks or meditating, or, I lived in a basement for what, 2 years or something, reading books. Like, I'm all about the monastery, baby. Studebaker's been talking about that. But there's also an example that without an effective social coordination mechanism that can show that, then it's going to be hard for people to be attracted to that or even to know how to organize themselves accordingly, right? So those are some issues. But let me give it to Philip here. Philip, it is good to see you, you handsome man. I hope you're doing well.
Ditto, brother. Everything is awesome. I think we have to ask ourselves the question, like just the addition, how to be in but not of the corporate world. Recognizing that, like, I think I saw the other day, like the derivative market is like $250 or something like this. Like to kind of just accept, like, you're probably going to take some heat from people who have a little more naive uh view of like what you're spouting, because they're going to be like, okay, you're saying all this stuff, but you're still like exchanging dollars, you're still funding Israel's efforts with your taxes, give me my tree fitted, like all these good things. And I wonder if, like, a more sort of like artistic subjectivity could maybe come out of this metaphysics of money, where, like, at first we see Nietzsche says God is dead, then it's the physicists, there's only matter, then the physicists say there's actually not even matter. There's just the illusion of matter created by crisscrossing atoms, vibrations, etc. And then someone goes, oh, well, there's money, we can lean on money. And someone goes, there's actually not really money. There's sort of like the illusion of it, but you're still caught up in this web. So I think, like, what do? Do you try to work as little as possible and maximize your per hour take? Reduce costs through like a minimalist lifestyle? How many people are going to go for that? Do you wait for some kind of like great simplification where we're forced, due to certain failures in the supply chain, to change our way of life? Do you preemptively say, hey guys, if we keep on doing this, our kids are going to have terrible lives? But then you'll come up against things that are like, no, we're actually going to innovate ways. Like, people have always said this. We're going to innovate ways to, whatever, feed people, get off this planet, become interstellar. And I think the question of subjectivity when it comes to specifically the liminal web would be like, no, I do all this like capital corporate stuff and am still a lifelong learner. Like, there's a way of the affirming and I think to me it comes down to like seeing through almost everything I've been taught about how much of my brain is necessary to earn a wage. Like, I think it's less than 1%. This like I'm very bullish on how powerful our brains are. I know, like, sanity is a very thin line. Like, keeping that is very, very important when you start thinking about these things. Because generally, like, people around you, what is it? They just like blink and they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, let's talk about the sports. And that's well and good. I just think that this admission, so that you're like, okay, I did my job. My job was 8 hours. Everyone before me said after 8 hours of job, then comes, whatever, sitting with Duff's beer or whatever, staring at the screen, doing your thing. And you're just like, nah, actually, like, I kind of know that I have a lot more energy, but then I think it means centering your life on this risk, where people are just going to be like, so you're doing something that alienates you even more from people. You're talking online with people every once in a while. No one really knows what you're saying. And like what you're doing is, it's like a 10 to 15 year unfolding process to understand how to begin the conversation. Like this is a rigor that I'm not sure it's for, I mean, it's probably for anyone who wants it. But I think like just understanding that a new subjectivity can come from exhibiting all of that. Because I think what it taps into is what you were talking with Ebert about with the unreasonable power. That if you can get to the point where you're not projecting externally this unreasonable power, you can like harness it. And this, I think, is the way that the attention economy becomes navigable. Is by like literally, I don't know. Tell me if you feel like this at all, Daniel. Like I don't feel like I'm ever like doing philosophy or writing or anything. I just feel like I'm not doing all the other distractions. That's it. And I'll just like every once in a while sit down and it'll be like, okay, I'm not doing all the other distractions. Oh, here's this thing. And then I just play with it for a little bit and then, on to the next. So yeah, I wonder what you think about all that.
No, delightful. And then I'll pass it on. And Dimitri just dropped a fantastic song lyric in the chat. Really nice, Dimitri. That was hot. Yeah, well, there's a few things. I was speaking with Seth recently on the idea that I think philosophy is something you need to not realize you're doing. You just go, wait, oh, this is philosophy? I didn't know. Like, it's just something you find yourself in, which to one is a key characteristic of a kind of self-forgetfulness that seems to be better afforded by certain economic situations versus others, right? Like, but I definitely think if you say, I want to do philosophy, that's bad, right? It just needs to be very natural. Like, and like I guess Michelle and I will just talk about this all, and then I'll give it to Michelle, is like, if you just follow a thought to a certain end, it leads to things that seem to end up in philosophy, right? That's how I think it's kind of more supposed to be, other than intending it. And actually, I think that's important because I do think that has economic ramifications, because let me explain why. That is non-zero sum. Us having a philosophical discussion does not require us to consume goods that other people can't have. We can all benefit from it. So there's a non-zero sumness to it versus a zero sumness, right? If we're talking about a new economy that's perhaps more sustainable, that's more creative, that's not falling into the commodity form, there has to have more what? Non-zero sumness versus zero sumness, right? And a lot of the activities of what seems to make us more human, funny enough, are actually in the realm of non-zero sum, but they seem kind of silly to do, like conversations like this, or look at the lilies of the field, right? Like those are like one of the things I want to say with Ivan Illich tonight. If I were to sum up everything that Illich wants to say as a core thinker, is that the only way to be fully human is to do something that people think is stupid. Like you have to do something that everyone's going to look at and be like, that's dumb. You have no option. If you want to have conviviality versus manipulation or lose your humanity, you have no choice but to do something that's going to look silly to others, because otherwise you're in the cultural logic that's leading to all of these different problems and different things. And I would call that the non-zero sumness necessary for overcoming Nash equilibria or game theory dynamic problems. That is the logic of capital and all this other stuff, right? The other thing I was going to say that just in honor of Seth's work that I think is very important, like when it's like look, like on this idea of what we should be spending our time doing. Like again, look at the birds of the air. It's incredible how hard it is to look. Like Seth was making the example of when you hold your thumbs like this and you switch, it blew my mind. Like just little things that you do with your body and you realize you've never been in your body before. Like we could spend like a few months actually learning our body, and that may actually be a radical impact on how we use our time and spend our money, because then we might not be consuming to avoid the feeling that we're not at home in our body, right? So there might be a bunch of little things like that that seem to be really important. And also, I actually think there you go. That's Bob. Excellent. And there's I think actually another thing is a lot of people actually like in relationships struggle with conversations, like learning to not be always feeling hurt or misunderstood all the time. That's another thing. So I do actually think, let me put it this way, and I'll give it to Marcel and then Javier and then whoever wants to speak. I actually think there's a lot of things like body, speaking, seeing. If you did those, then you'll actually find yourself doing philosophy because you'll be freed up. Like your energy will be freed up and you'll actually be able to follow a conversation to a philosophical place without intending it to. I think there's a lot of emotional barriers. I think there's a lot of mental barriers that actually, if you freed up, lead us to just doing it. As opposed, like if you're like, hey, how do we increase everyone's like consciousness or whatever to make them more philosophical, but you're not doing the work of like freeing up their blockage or the fact that they have trauma with their family, then it's probably going to be not the correct kind of philosophy. It's actually going to be the glass bead game to get status to feel better against all of those traumas subconsciously. But if you work on those blockage, that kind of non-zero overflow of humanity starts to come out. But of course, the problem is the following: a lot of those stuff to deal with traumas or whatever are actually through means that everyone thinks are stupid. Because if not, everyone would have already done them and everyone would be out of their traumas, right? So that's also the problem, is that a lot of the things that we need to do to get out of ourselves or to get out of our own way actually have a certain absurdity to them that they must, precisely because otherwise we would have already done it. And I think Ivan Illich just shows that in schooling and medicine and so many different areas, that in order to be fully human, you have to do something that seems kind of crazy to everyone else. But that goes back to the old religious tradition, doesn't it? But let me pass it to Michelle and then.
So yeah, this is all really interesting, and this is just what came to my brain for some reason as Philip was talking in particular, but generally with philosophy, I don't know if it's like just selfish, as I just have these questions that just don't stop. Like I'll have a simple conversation at the YMCA with somebody, and then I'm just like thinking about it. Like I'm thinking about it. And again, I say maybe it's selfish because a lot of the reasons why I'm still thinking about it is because I'm self-reflecting, right? Maybe somebody shared something that they did, like a statement I heard recently, like, I'm very religious, so me and my wife chose to do this because we feel it's our obligation. I'm just telling you something. This is very abstract, but that's just a framework. So then you hear that, you listen, you're talking with the person. That's interesting. Oh, that's great, and whatever. And then afterwards, it's like, that's fascinating, right? Like somebody has in their mind a sense of what it means to feel religiously obligated, and in some ways, it's the thing that they did because of that obligation they felt is a wonderful thing. Like it's a necessary thing that helps other lives, and it's like, okay, but why did they feel that particular obligation and not another type of religious obligation, for example? Like for me, that's why I start to do the philosophical stuff, because I don't know why. Like for some people, they just they have the I don't know. I mean, and it's fine. Maybe they're better off to just have the conversation and they leave it and they never think about it again. Or maybe everybody does think about it to a degree. But for me, yeah, there's obviously the paranoid direction, like where you have these questions and you start to just wonder, like, am I making the right life decisions because that person made a different life decision? There's that direction, which is not helpful. But I do think there's an interesting angle to it where you start to think about, like, it can help you refine your own sense of self and your own values, or your own, those questions for me hopefully can kind of like bring perspective. Like there's the automatic thoughts that come up, and maybe even self-judgments or critiques, and then you kind of step back a little bit and then try to parse out, kind of like untangle those, and then you kind of keep moving through it. Now, you could just get stuck there and feel certain things, or I don't know, have certain senses of what you should or want to be doing, and then never do it because you just leave it in the thought realm, right? Well, oh, well, we all just find these like justifications, so they must find it that way, and I find it this way, and so then I just, like that. So there's risks with like thinking through the questions, but I think there is something that is benefit. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's like, I think it's beneficial, but I just can't, like, my brain just seems to do that. That's why I tend to, I guess, engage in things that might seem like to some more philosophical, or like you're still thinking about it when maybe other people would maybe not be thinking about it still. But the hope is that it can like retrospectively not just be in the thought world, but actually my like lived experience and like the decisions I'm going to make, right? Or the decisions I'm making. And then this made me think too of like what Philip was saying about the like attention economy and like consumerism. I was thinking about how much there's like a risk with just the internet like optionalities. But then again, I was like, well, it can show you different options that maybe are, something you're like, oh, that's actually like, because somebody took the time to create this other type of business model. It's still a business, but it's like really, it's something that is, I don't know, let's just say it's all about like recycling, or it's all about like, thrifting things. But the thing is, like, you have to create new habits if you want to, like, if you just see it all the time, you're like, yeah, that's cool. Like, I love that they do that. Or I love that that's an option, but you never take the step to do the change. It's like, then it kind of is like just stays in the consumptive in terms of your time, just looking at this stuff and never really doing anything with it. But if you can like try to do that again, like, it's not just in the thought, it's in the action, and then it's not just in the observation and the learning, it's in the actually doing the things. I think like that's when it can be beneficial, but you have to limit yourself, because you're like, okay, I've done the stuff. Like, you either just make the choice, like let me just give you another random example. Like, if you're like, oh, okay, I really believe in like local, supporting like a local dairy farmer. Let me call the local dairy farmer. Super cool. Like, the fact that you could find out about them, or find they have a website, see they have a number, you call them, you get to talk to them. You're like, wow, it's like a real human who cares about like, actually treating animals and people well, whatever. And so then like,
okay, this just turned off. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, cool. So, anyways, it's like, it's the feedback loop, I think, that can be, but it can get stuck. Like, it can just get stuck in that like virtuality of thought, or virtuality of the internet, where if you can like use those nuggets of things you actually learn, or actually self-reflect on, and maybe cause for a positive, I want to say positive change, or whatever, or just maybe affirmation, or a sense of like continuing on with whatever your choices are, or something, then I think it can be a really good thing. And I'm just bringing up about the dairy farmer, because it's like, sometimes it's permissions for stuff like that, because it's stuff that is different. Like, your habit loop is just buy this pants on Amazon. Not that that's wrong, I'm just saying. But like, you find out, oh, there's actually a thrift shop that like, or even an online thrift shop that, it's thrifting the best. Like, maybe you're looking for like organic wool pants, but you can't find that from like your state. So then you're like, well, at least I'm doing something that like is a little bit closer to what I want to be able to do. You know what I'm saying? And same with the dairy, like, it's like, oh, other people like know this farm and they have good experiences, and then you can take a step toward that too. But if you stay in the virtuality of just the like research, and you never make a decision one way or the other, it kind of can feel like a waste of time. But maybe it isn't. I don't know. Maybe you end up like making the decision, at some point. I'm trying to be like really honest about like the kind of the way that Michelle engages with virtuality, whether it's my brain or the internet. But I hope that all makes sense. And yeah, thanks.
And Mr. Jockin, good to see you. I enjoyed your conversation with Javier recently. And no, I think, well, there's a few things, and then I'll give it to Javier. Dimitri, is like, basically philosophy, we've talked about it before, self-defense. Also, you are going to absorb values. Rand talked about philosophy as secondhand smoke. You are going to absorb some worldview, whether you mean to or not. And if you don't have philosophy, you have very little chance of defending yourself from that. Likewise, the other issue is it is economic, because you are probably always already situated in an idea of a good use of time, what's practical, what's making the most of your potential. And if you never question that, which how could you without philosophy, other than doing it within the options presented to you by the zeitgeist, which is not really alternative, it's just or horizontal choice with that, then your course is set. Also, too, how are you going to not keep up with the Joneses if you don't have something like philosophy to actually give you the capacity to question when you should do what the Joneses are doing and when you shouldn't do what the Joneses are doing? Wouldn't it be lovely if you could just say anything the Joneses do, I'm not going to do? But life is not so easy. Sometimes the Joneses have a really good idea on going to that particular store to get food, right? So you have to discern. Oh, shoot. How do you discern? That's really hard. Like philosophy, and then Mr. Parsons, and good to see you, sir. Philosophy, when it's tied to choice making, is, I think, much more sensible. And when you're trying to defend your capacity to see what is in front of you, not just simply absorb it according to, say, the commodity form, or, most people see trees most people see trees like that as pretty, not as a potential source of a strike of beauty, to allude to Mr. Jockin's view, like Jockin's work, right? Like you always already are bringing to the things you look at a notion of the potential they contain. I think also we're confused about philosophy because we don't have a metaphysics of an idea that things are kind of moving, that there's a kind of movement, a kind of life to everything. And because if you think that, then philosophy as getting yourself out of your own way becomes really important. Like the tree is trying to come towards you as beauty, and yet we tend to be in our own way of seeing the tree as such, right? Like if you don't have this, like I think philosophy is a lot of deconstructing blockage, or things are blocking you from unfolding, like things are in your way of seeing what's in front of you. So much of thinking is about unblocking a process that is always alive and unfolding that we naturally get out of the habit of being able to habituate ourselves to, right? Like our body is trying to get lazy and conserve energy so we don't use it. Our eyes are trying to just compress information, and we have to fight against that and self-defend ourselves against that. Otherwise, things don't unfold in their fullness, and that is a kind of mystical and religious activity. And it would have economic consequences, I think. But let me give it to Javier and Dimitri. Mr. Sweeney, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. Always a pleasure. And Mr. Rivera, please.
Yeah, I mean, recently I had a conversation with my brother, and he was like, he was accusing me of philosophizing in the conversation, which was just like, I mean, I was actually genuinely shocked because I was like, I'm not in a conversation. I'm not on the net. Like, I was like, I'm not on the net. I was like, I didn't know I was philosophizing. And he's like, yeah, you just think so like deep of things, you know? And I'm sitting there like, that's deep. What I said was deep. What I said was deep. I was honestly genuinely just shocked about the I was saying something deep. But that kind of it's funny because he kind of threw me out of my own self-forgetting, ironically, which then made me paranoid about being like, oh, if I say this, it might be too much now. You know, it really like threw me off the cuff of the conversation, which I wasn't expecting. But I think this is important, right? So I've been meditating again, and I had this moment where, of course, it was a distraction in meditation, but I couldn't. After the meditation, I was like really thinking about it. I had this moment where I had this super realization of like my suffering and then the indefinable suffering of another person. And it just like it like literally like basically like brought me to tears because I was like how are we ever like mean to anybody, because there's just like this undefinable suffering of every person that we're talking to, like we just have no idea. But the problem is after my meditation, it was I didn't have that bodily experience anymore. So it was hard to maintain the awareness of that very principle. But I understood, like, I think it's still true. The problem is I haven't cultivated the practice to really like, you could say in the Buddhist terms, like I haven't cultivated the compassion, the open-heartedness to like really, be compassionate to another person. And so doing these bodily practices like praying, meditation, yoga, all this other stuff, I think for me, philosophy was really good for being an overthinker. Like you could hide as an overthinker in philosophy because it's almost seamless, right? There's always more questions, there's never ends, like it's just perfect. The problem is that you're not ever dealing with the emotional unloading, the unconscious unloading. And so when you're having philosophical conversations and there's a lot of resistance, defensiveness, and everything, it's hard to be present in conversations. So I've noticed that, there definitely needs to be an oscillation going on, at least for myself. I don't know about everybody else. I'm pretty sure everybody's on a different, starting point than I am, but a different oscillation, and more silence for me, in my opinion. And I think once I started paying attention to more silence, I started realizing that there is a lot of superfluousness going on. Like there's a lot of like unnecessary talking. There's a lot of like unnecessary activity going on. And it's super strange. Like, and I think this was also the first time I got hyper aware of my activity on the phone of like, why am I looking at this shit? Like, I don't know why. Like I was like, I have no idea why I'm looking at this shit. Like it literally has just no purpose at all. It's the kind of useless attention giving stuff that has no cultivation to the self whatsoever. And this is not to moralize this kind of use, but it's just to say that I think when it comes to like when we study like Buddhism and mystical pathways and other religious forms, their argument is this: if you pay attention to the right thing, everything becomes transparent to you. You don't need to think about what to do. You don't need to think about what needs to be done. There's a sort of transparency and flowness. I liked Jockin's word. He was talking to me earlier today. There's a kind of fluency to your being if you pay attention to the right thing. The question is, what's the right thing that we need to pay attention to? And this is the argument that I think all religions have been arguing about. But also to be fair, because I think I think Sweetie said we don't need to think. I don't want to be confused with the anti-intellectualist position. I don't want to be confused. But I think the thinking can be done when we are in this state of fluency. And I think philosophers are afraid of always letting go and being in that mode of self-forgetting sometimes, at least on a bodily level. But yeah.
Well, no, that's brilliant. I mean, David Hume, one of the great philosophical traditions that's lost, I think, is the Parion. I'm not saying it correctly, where the greatest problem of philosophy is philosophy itself. The tendency to use it to avoid reality, to think in terms of category versus suchness, to avoid things and so on and so forth. Oh, but guess what? The only way to deal with that problem is philosophy. That is the cause of that problem. Also, for David Hume, you're required because people are coming to manipulate you. As the government grows, as the king, people are coming and telling you to serve them or do what they say. And they'll have really good arguments. And if you don't have mental self-defense, you'll be manipulated, right? Also, you are in your own way of participating in that flow, right? But what you were saying, I'll give it to Dimitri, Luber, and then Seth. But this is very important because if you believe that reality has some sort of inherent unfolding to it, some sort of movement toward the beautiful, some sort of time as fundamental, or capital C creativity in a Whiteheadian sense, right? Then that truth organizes values. That changes the role of everything. Everything then is about dwelling, in an Ivan Illich sense, the art of living, the clearing in a Heideggerian sense, to let things be because being is always a letting, creating. Being is being with an ing and like italicized, right? It has a fundamental becoming to it, right? And again, that wild verse, look at the birds of the air, as if, do you see that things are not already happening? Do you not see? It's like, no, I've never learned to look. It's hard, isn't it? The other thing, though, that helped me think all of this, because it's obvious philosophy matters, but then there's a point where it's bad. It's obvious economics matters, but then there's a point where it's bad. It's obvious that health matters, but then you can be obsessive. Oh, crap. So we need all of the things. The only way to get the one is the many, and the many that isn't a one is fragments, right? The problem of the many and the one is the situation of life. And a way I think about it is it's really important. You know how in Christianity they talk about the fruit of the Spirit? It's actually really interesting. It's not the fruits of the Spirit, it's the fruit of the Spirit. As if the only way to get the fruit is to have all of the attributes, generosity, kindness, peace. It's not that each is an individual fruit. It's as if you don't get all the pieces, you don't get the fruit at all, which is actually what I think life is like. If you don't learn to have body, art, seeing, philosophy, thinking, friends, relationships, I could make a song. Maybe we can do a song, right? Like if you don't get them all, you don't get any substance. You don't get any substance. You get no fruit, actually. Well, that's really hard. And then, of course, another reason why you seem to need philosophy is because you're always being trained into habits by your environment and to not getting the whole fruit. You're overemphasizing intellectualism. You're overemphasizing, maybe you can overemphasize relationships in a way that make them shallow and escapist, right? Everything can be overfit. Everything can be underfit. Mr. Sweeney, it's a pleasure, sir. Always good to see you. Thank you. Always a delight. Like everything in the wrong order, precisely because in the right order it can be good. Everything that's good, if in the right order, is good, but that means it can also be the absence of good in the wrong order, right? Well, right there is a problem why you need thinking, because it is not self-evident the right order, and the right order today could be the wrong order tomorrow, and what you need to emphasize on Wednesday may be what you need to de-emphasize. Oh, crap. It's like an active, continual unfolding thought, as if life is alive and we're constantly changing and have to negate the negation and work toward beauty and everything. Yeah, it is, isn't it? That's funny. So, the very fact that there's that level of engagement means we always have to be undergoing self-defense from that of which would stagnate us into a single part, a single one of the many, so that we don't even have the one at that point anymore. So there's quite a bit of an art to being human, I think. But let me give it to Dimitri, Mr. Luber, and then Seth. Dimitri, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well today.
This is a nice conversation. I was thinking today about this crazy paradox that if you want to be a proper philosopher, whatever that means, if you want to do philosophy, let's call it that, you have to stop doing research at a certain point and get out of it. Descartes himself said he was working in the army for 3 years and didn't really read at all back when he was doing it, and he said, like, if I didn't do that, I wouldn't come to to know what I know now, when he was like talking about his own philosophy, when he was living in Sweden at the end of his life. So yeah, there's such a necessity to getting out of the book and getting out of the reading and getting out of the writing too. And they're all traps, right? Like reading has its own trap, but then writing also has its own trap. You can read too much, but then you can also write too much. And when is it enough? When have you read enough so you can write? But when is it too much writing so you actually have to read? And maybe you don't have to do either of those. And there's never a point at which you can come to decide, okay, definitively I've read enough. Because it's always like you write your thing, and then you come across this book, is like, oh my God, everything that I wrote down is basically this book that I didn't read. That's how I feel, at least a lot of times when I'm writing. So yeah, that's difficult. That's quite difficult. But I think that Javier, I'm going to defend your brother here. I think your brother was right to accuse you of being too philosophical, because I think philosophy is some kind of hystericization, right? It confronts you with the unknown, and that's in a way the philosophical gesture. It's very intimate in that sense, right? And in that sense, being confronted by philosophy hystericizes you. You start doubting yourself. You start doubting how you even have to doubt. Like, how does it even work? And I think that's so. Yeah, maybe he was he had his own philosophical moment. You should have accused him back. Look, you are being philosophical now by calling this philosophical.
But it's funny because this is really good point to jump on this, is that I realized the reason why he was accusing me is because he wanted advice from me, and all I was doing was creating more questions. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
I actually saw the moment because of this. I started telling him what to do because he was the one hystericizing. Actually, like you're right, he was the one that was hystericizing. So I was like, "You're actually overthinking it too much. This is what you need to
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
This is what you
Okay.
need to do." Because he was like, this is maybe a little bit personal, but he was like, "What does it mean to be a man?" And I was like, "Dude, that question, if you keep asking that, is a black hole. That is a black hole of a question." I was like, because every time I hear somebody explain to me what is a man, it's like a social function. I have my responsibility, nice, take care, protect. You know, it's a social function. There's nothing unique I hear in those attributes, and that's what I was trying to point to him.
Yeah.
But I just told him what to do at that point.
Yeah. Just to add one more point about philosophy and hystericization is that the beauty of Descartes' gesture is that he goes through this process of doubt and he's just probably being very jittery in his chair, like, what way do I have to go? What way do I have to go? Where's the truth? And then he falls into this point of absolute certitude. I think, therefore I am. The most empty point you could ever make. Like, who gives a shit? Of course, that's the case. But the beauty of this is, I think, what Hegel would have called substance as subject. On the other hand, on the one hand, it gives you a certitude, the certitude that thought is being. I think, therefore I am. They're equated. There's an is sign there, a copula. But then also, it's the most moot point you could ever make. Like, of course, I think, therefore I am. It's super boring to hear this. It's not satisfying at all, right? Of course, then Descartes goes into how actually God is up there, and he's helping me not to deceive, not to be deceived, and then it gets boring, in my view, anyhow. But yeah, like, I think philosophy is about hystericization, but also by going through that process, still finding a link between thought and being. And I think this is very important. I think that's also the Parmenidean gesture, at least on the side of the relationship between thought and being. And yeah, you could then say, okay, Dimitri, but would you say that Kant is then not a philosopher because he says thought does not equal being? There's a dualism. Thought can never get at being. Well, that's a difficult philosophical discussion to get into. But I would wager this, though. I would wager this. Yeah.
No, lovely. And again, Javier, just carry around an encyclopedia and be like, don't worry, I got this. And you just open and be like, there, right there, So it's putt-putt golf, actually. That's what it is. You just go and play putt and be like, of course, it's so obvious. And I'll give it to Luber and then Seth here. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it makes me think of Seth's work. It's like there's this, like, when's writing too much versus reading too much? I think part of the problem is we try to solve it just using our brain when we need our whole body to think, actually, because there's always this bifurcating problem of overfitting, underfitting. If you think about it, in thought, you could never resolve that tension, right? But maybe if you look at your whole body as an apparatus, you can go, well, maybe I'm reading too much because I no longer am able to look at a tree or see the birds of the air. Maybe I'm writing too much because my hand hurts. That's a good reason to think you're writing too much, not that persevere, go through it. Like your body sends you signals that matter, right? And so, like, listening to the body, Michelle and I will talk about, like, listening to it. We don't actually trust our bodies anymore, actually. Like, I bring this up because Illich makes the point in Medical Nemesis where he's like, all of health is like, that's right, it's not a category of truth. Never mind, everyone. Ignore your body. Just ask ChatGPT. Anything. But in medical, he's basically like, surgery assumes that the body heals itself. Like, it would never work if you didn't assume the body could heal itself, right? Like, all of medicine assumes the body can heal itself. Otherwise, it doesn't really work, right? Well, there's a way in which the parts where thought is damaged in a way, or where thought cannot complete itself. Maybe that's where you need to assume that the body can heal itself, that there's something that needs to be healed in the whole apparatus that has been missed. And I think the best philosopher, well, certainly the Scottish Enlightenment, the counter Enlightenments were like, yeah, philosophy leads to what Hume called philosophical melancholia, unless you refer back to common life, refer back to suchness, refer back to something concrete. Otherwise, you'll go mad. And we did. That's just the spread of philosophical consciousness, Peter Berger and all that. But let me give it to Luber and then Seth. Luber, it is good to see you, sir. I've been enjoying your talk with Javier and hope that you are doing well wherever you may be.
What's up, guys?
I thought you were
What's up,
walking
guys?
dogs and making bank again. You're not making bank
No.
again? Oh,
There's a limit,
to
I
how much
felt
money you
the
can make? I
I
just
felt
made
the
too much.
pain.
I just
My
made too
feet
much.
my feet were walking on money and it started hurting too much. So I was like, that's when I gotta stop right
That's it. I'm
there.
Scrooge McDuck now. I need to swim some. I need to swim.
Yeah. Oh my God. This has been good. A couple things that I want to touch on is just, I guess, first my own thought with what Daniel, when you were saying that humans need to be stupid, there needs to be the stupidity. It reminds me of like a net from like a year ago where we were talking about AI and the art gallery, and like how can we distinguish between when it gets to a certain point with AI, like AI art versus human art, when it's like from an appearance point of view, pretty indistinguishable. We have to kind of be delusional. The thing with this stupidity is that AI can't forget its information. Like once you put in information, there is no forgetting it. But humans, we can forget information all the time. So like we need to tap into that sentiment, and under that sentiment is delusionality, stupidity, from a crude standpoint, wasting time. Like AI doesn't know what it means to waste time. If anything, each upgrade is an attempt to not waste time. You got ChatGPT 2.0. That shit was not efficient time wise. Like it took too long to actually generate answers. And then you got 3 and then 3.5 and then 4, etc. And each upgrade, they just tried to shrink the amount of time it would take to, compute information. But then there was like a hiccup where with ChatGPT 4, it was more, they said it has more reason. So because it has more reason, it actually took more time to generate answers than ChatGPT 3.0. And the funny thing with that is that only was a short-lived period because they were like, we're wasting time. It's taking too long. So now it's just as fast. It's essentially the same speed. The concept of lack is what AI is trying to overcome. And like with that, it actually can't ever be an unfolding. Like that's the funny thing about an unfolding. It's always contingent off of attention, but from our human perspective, our approach to that tension is always lacking. And because of that, there's an unfolding that sprouts out of it because we have to come to grips with that lack. And the only way to come to grips with that lack is this unfolding that we ultimately have to step out of the way of in order to actually like see it, in order to actually understand that we're lacking. So AI, and I know we're not talking about AI. I know I'm digressing, but the AI needs humans because we are fundamentally lacking, and it's such a good thing. Like we have such a power over them because we can dictate AI on how it can help us unfold our own lack. And like that is the main distinguishment in my mind that like, because Daniel, I think you said a couple of weeks ago, because it stuck with me. It's like, how can human beings have a quality that AI just can't? And that's how we'll survive. So the point here is that how we need to act in accordance to this fundamental lack, or just in other words, being stupid, is we kind of have to double down and lean into it. Like, we have to actually get to the point where we write where our fingers hurt and we have to stop. We actually have to get to these limit points, because if we don't get to these limit points, AI won't be able to evolve. Like, it's actually the funny, ironic thing, which is AI needs the humans to hit their limit in order for AI to adjust accordingly, for humans to then be released, or like in Javier's language, need to empty out. Like we need to empty ourselves out in order for a new unfolding to occur, for us to then hit a new limit. So it's all part of this necessary feedback loop, where we actually got to the place where we can't empty out ourselves. So we have technology to aid us in help in emptying out, but we won't actually able to see this healthy relationship. Like, to me, this is actually quite healthy and makes me very pro technology and AI, because it's all for the sake of an unfolding and then stepping out of the way, which entails always hitting a limit and helping one find the limit. So what else was I thinking? Dimitri, one of Desmond's, Dimitri left, whatever. One of Desmond's approaches to this concept of humor is that it's actually in accordance to when Jockin said to you, Javier, that like God is above being, like God is beyond being, where being is like the tension point in which you realize something ironic, or there's, from an emotive standpoint, a spilling over where we just can't help but to release and laugh. You know, someone like, you know, when someone like falls and it's like they're okay, but when they fall, it's just like initially just like you kind of burst out laughing because of just the way they contorted themselves, and it was just like awkward or something of that sort. And it's just funny. It's because it's like unbelievable. And that unbelievable moment is the moment in which being releases itself. This is Desmond's thought. Being releases itself, and you're in the godly dimension, and all you can do in that dimension is just laugh. Like, it's literally the ability to, like for Desmond, to be with God is to actually laugh or cry, because it's beyond the moment of when thinking meets being. It's like the next step beyond that moment. So I think to tie that to what I was saying, to how to operate in a world where we know we have to be stupid, is that we have to position ourselves where we try to find our limit emotionally, so we're in a constant state of laughter or sadness. And like, that might sound a bit harsh with the sad part, or like even the laughing part where you're like, oh, everyone needs to be like the Joker and just like uncontrollably laugh. It's not quite that. It's those are the moments where you need to understand in reflection that is the moment in which you begin to empty out. Like, you empty yourself through laughter and sadness. And in that moment of emptying out through laughter and sadness, you're actually with God, because you're beyond the moment, you're beyond when thinking meets being. And then also, something I'm really picking up with Schelling, and then I'll pass it off. There's something in the prehistoric where he makes this argument where mythology is primordial to poiesis, such that it's not considered an art like mythology. it's just like an inherent response to forgetting the event horizon point of that time. And it's funny that it made me think, what is the mythology that we're operating under universally? And it's kind of obscure. And I'm like, wait a second, if it's kind of obscure, we're kind of at a similar point to the prehistoric point where the event horizon was kind of obscure, so a mythology emerged. But the difference between, at least from like what Schelling's saying, is the difference between our epoch and our time and that time is that they didn't go through this process of mythology creating poeses, which eventually creates science, and thinking keeps, progressing and has its own history. So now that we have our own history with this, what would it look like for us to kind of emulate this prehistoric moment? And to me, it's actually the ironic move, which is poeses has to actually help create a science of the boundary conditions of what makes mythology possible. And in that focus point, humans will be able to create their own mythos, which is tied to the universal parameter of what makes a mythology possible. Because back in the prehistoric time, it wasn't really what's the parameter of making mythology possible. It was, this is the mythos based off of a response of trying to recall the event that you can't quite remember. Now it's not quite the same. The times are different. Now I think the universal is the boundary condition of what makes mythology possible, and that the actual praxis is abiding by those parameters based off your own individual context set. And that is how you can have your own personal mythos as it relates to a universal parameter of what a mythos can be. I know I said a lot, but yeah, this has been a great conversation. I'll pass it off.
No, delightful. I think what's happened right now is like what Philip Reef warned is that Jung would become very popular. But the issue is that the current understanding of mythos, everyone would get their own private archetype, which would lead to a bunch of atomization until you are able to make the step of understanding the constraint of which creates the order of the possibility of the archetype. And at that point, until you do that, you can't have the universal, and you'll just have the other fragmentation into atomized enclosures of people's own private religions that Mr. Philip Reef would believe would basically be the end of civilization. So this kind of understanding the boundary condition is very important. And I'll give it to Seth here. And Michael, it is good to see you. What's very interesting is right now, precisely where AI is kind of bringing to the forefront our limit, that is precisely the kind of space where perhaps one can see this boundary condition, but it's also precisely the technology that has brought us to that place has trained us out of the capacity to see what's in front of us. So, like the very things that have brought you to this place simultaneously and affording this opportunity remove from you the capacity to realize that opportunity, because human beings are a great Kafka story joke, right? Like that's the thing, capitalism, for example, in its very increasing of the access to material well-being, the very increase of commodity and different things can train you to only be able to understand reality in terms of utility and price, thus removing from you the capacity to make the most of that material well-being into an extension of humanity versus our replacement. Like that's where Ivan Illich was saying was the problem with moving out of subsistence society to market societies. They, in that very act, although they opened up avenues of human potential, they at the ironic same time disabled us from the capacity to realize that intent of human potential. How do we avoid that irony? Well, that probably has something to do with getting back to what it is to be human. What is it that humans have that AI doesn't? A body. What can we experience that AI can't? Qualia. There might be experience in qualitative experience that is not possible in quantitative experience. I think also you mentioned tears. Tears and laughter is very interesting because they're fundamentally AB. You tend to cry at the worst times of life and the happiest. The only way to know the difference is you. You have to be able to discern that difference, right? You can tell the difference. And there's something about those powerful experiences that have a kind of fundamental AB to them, which requires a relation to discern the difference, that then requires being able to think the whole of the person to identify. But precisely the fact that the facticity of the tier cannot tell you what it means, right there means there's an additional supra layer, a mystical layer, an additional layer that's not reducible to facticity to determine the meaning of it, that you would have to be able to situate it to know. But here's the problem. We tend to be trained to be incapable of identifying those kind of things because we're too much in our head. We're too informational, so we can't tell the difference between the experience of a tear of joy or a tear of sorrow, a laughter of joy, or a laughter of madness, because that would we'd have to be not disabled from being a full human being. And we'd have to also cultivate capacities to have those experiences. But I think what you were saying as well on us having a quote unquote lack in the ability to say dwell in time that AI cannot, that is precisely what we need to lean into to lead AI as a tool to help extend humanity convivially versus be replaced by AI. But this poses a challenge, and then I'll give it to Seth here, because if I said to you, hey, everyone, you can do whatever you want to with your life. Pretty terrifying, right? Now you're responsible. You have to decide. You have to think about what you like. It sounds wonderful, but the very horizon that opens up possibility also brings with it a certain terror, right? So likewise, when you lean into the things that make us fully human, it opens doors that we've never opened before, and that could be terrifying. But if we don't open those doors, then we can't lean into the quality that makes us uniquely human and not replaceable by AI. So we better learn to open those doors. But then, to Seth's work, if we are not familiar with emotions, then when we start to feel fear, we may automatically interpret that as evidence that we're doing the wrong thing because we choose the meaning of our emotions and we're not used to those emotions. And therefore, right when we're not at an opportunity to open a door into full humanity is precisely when we have a feeling that we interpret as evidence we should keep the door closed. So actually understanding the meaning of these experiences, I think, is very, very important. But let me give it to Seth here. Seth, it is good to have you here, and it is a pleasure, sir. Let me give it to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invite, and pleasure to meet all of you to the degree that we can call this a meeting on the internet. There's so much here, but it's really fun. So people here may have seen that Daniel and I spoke recently. And part of what I really enjoyed, and I heard it when Michelle was speaking earlier. Yeah, and I remember you, Michael. I think we did some dialogos together at one point, friends with Jake Favor, a friend of ours. Yeah, so it's cool to just make some connections, and then I'm seeing names of people I haven't met but heard of. You know, this is kind of how the liminal web works. And but as I was saying to you, Daniel, when we spoke, like there'd be a really easy way for me to disqualify myself from being in this Zoom room if I defined philosophy in certain ways, right? Particularly the reading but yeah, like what Michelle was saying, it's like you're in a conversation and you just keep thinking about it, right? And then at a certain point you look around and it's like other people don't keep thinking about it as much as, and there's even a way that what is clearly enjoyed by everyone here and which feels so good to be a part of, even though I'm just jumping in for the first time. There'll be moments in your life where you're taught that that's like almost pathological. Like I remember a friend of my mother's who's kind of almost like a stepmother, she would say to me, you know, when you were young, you were so focused. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. And she said, it was almost scary. And I was like, oh, that doesn't sound good. I was like, is it okay to be really focused? Well, not like that, you know, like, so anyway, with all the threads that have been offered here, I guess a place that just fits to what I think about every day, but that feels like it runs through it is attention. So there's so many things we could pay attention to, obviously, but also something I'm appreciating, what I really enjoyed, even before we spoke, Daniel, when I listened to you speaking with Aspasia. So I know some of you know Aspasia, and that's how eventually I connected with Daniel. She started a conversation about what she calls authentic resonance, which when I attempt to put that quickly, it's like, despite all the stuff that we're talking about here and how difficult and complex life is, there's that moment where actually I know exactly what to do. And that like that doesn't happen often, but that would be authentic resonance as I'm understanding it. So we were kind of talking about that, and then yeah, so listening to you talk to Aspasia from a distance, let's say, as a fan of the liminal web who's heard of OG Rose, and I've heard Daniel talk to Guy Sengstock because that's someone else I know, and but from a distance and not really fully knowing your work, it's just like, well, this guy's smart, he's read a bunch of books, you know, all of this stuff. And so from the other end, a sort of a prejudice against philosophy is like, well, you know, does he know about the body? And I was very pleased when you were talking to Aspasia. It's like, oh, you kept talking about like, and not just the body, but like, as you have that quote from Hume about the common life, like just everyday things. Like it's not always about God and being and consciousness. Sometimes it's about like, you know, like what Michelle said. Someone said this today. What the hell is that? You know, what could be going on? But so you talk about those things, and I feel like if the subject of economics comes up, or if the subject of politics comes up, those are situations where I start to feel small and like I haven't done the homework and I don't really, you know, deserve to be here. But even that's embodied, right? So those subjects that I don't feel well read on, that's when I start to shrink and narrow and do things like that. So one of the paradoxes that I wanted to bring out in my experience, and I imagine others here probably can relate, is so my work is actually, it's about the body, but it's also very much about attention, right? And so someone might have some, let's call it a problem, and they say, Seth, can you help me with the problem? And I'll say, okay. And you know, one of the things we're going to do is work on the quality of your attention, because if we have higher quality attention, that might help with the problem. But these days, as I tell people about my work, and I'm, you know, also an entrepreneur trying to enroll people in a program, I've started saying things like, well, you may or may not have problems, but the world sure has a lot of problems, and you have to navigate this world. So even if you feel great and you've got great relationships and your bank account is all full, like, what about the fact that who the hell knows what's going to happen tomorrow? Like, how are you handling that? And a personal thing that happens for me is now I'm, you know, I'm talking about enrollment, but before enrollment, what do I have to do? I have to go fishing. I have to do marketing. And then, oh, I'm not very good at this. Let me take a business course. And then they tell me this is how you get people's attention. And then at a certain moment I go, wait a minute. Now I'm participating in the campaign to degrade people's attention by waving at them and saying, look at me, you know, and I'm like taking the thing that I have that I think can really help, but I'm trying to squash it down into a branded phrase. And then on the other hand, I'd say, well, don't get too carried away with, you know, your ethics or your morality or whatever this is, because this is also about being a competent human who knows how to actually make it in this economy. And so maybe one last thought I'll just share with the group that I think might resonate with some of the other things here is like, I could come into this room and think, wow, these people really are thinking about the kind of things that I'm thinking about. This interests me. That's great. And we stop talking about education or politics or whatever. And, you know, it doesn't feel like, you know, November 5 when you have the two choices between D and R and like up or down. It's like we can actually sit here and imagine what should education be like, or what should. But then you turn around and then you remember, but on November 5, all of the great ideas I heard at the net aren't actually on the ballot. And so there's still that. So I guess what I want to foreground here is there's something like having clarity about if I were king, right? How society would be, the ideal life, because I want to know what I'm working for. But they're really, if I'm too idealistic, I will drown in the reality of what is here and now. And so just the last thing is like, I get really excited when I say like learning from you, Daniel, that, well, you also run a center where people do weddings. And it's like, oh, awesome. This guy who's got all these great ideas, he also knows how to keep himself nourished. Like, and that seems like Yeah, right. And I make my assumptions that it's like, you know, because all I see is like the social media, the exterior, right? But it seems like if you wanted to have a society someday where everyone could flourish, like you were saying, everyone gets to decide what to do with their life. To get there from here, if you were to have leaders, or you were to have not even leaders, but people who inspire and show the way, those people would have to be kind of superhuman, because they have to both survive the shitty reality that we're dealing with, and on the side after work construct the new world, you know, and host the net and do all of these things at the same time. So sometimes when I think I'm doing really well, that's when I realize, fuck, I'm not getting enough sleep, you know, because like I did all these things that I was been meaning to do, and then it's like, anyway, I'll feel myself running on fumes now, so I'll stop. But
magnificent. No, thank you, Seth. Thank you for being here. And I like also kind of this emphasis on this idea of a feeling in the body going into a philosophical space, or like that's the thing. Whenever you turn, like basically anyone who turns on a CNN or Fox News, the first thing they feel is what? Anger. It's not purely intellectual. There's an anger, and they're playing on your anger, right? The whole media apparatus works because you do feel emotions when you watch, that your body gets invested into the thing. And I think also that movement you described, like when you walk into a new space or you see, but there's a shrinking, right? That is what I think is very interesting. When you win a race, what do people do? Throw their arms out, or they feel an expansion. But when you feel fear, there's a closing, right? What's very interesting, if we think of in that kind of language, it seems as if philosophy and thinking and life is about staying open to participate in the flowing. Like life already has a movement to it that if we crumple up, we get dense and sink. Whereas if we stay open, we float in a way, right? If I'm using a metaphor, it just turns out it's really freaking hard to stay open. And you kind of see that, like what happens in marriages, like a very lot of time in relationships when things get rough, it's not that, it's the feeling is a shrinking into, like you don't know what to talk about or how to talk about it's a feeling of a shrinking and a sinking, right? Whereas when you're having the best musical, it feels like opening, you're going with the flow, or you feel like you're floating on something, right? And I think that's interesting too, because like on mentioning the election, like there's ways to think of it as, we don't need, like there's the election is coming, life is coming. So there's a way in which what you need to do is be prepared for what's coming, not decide what the thing is when it, like there's a way in which what Ivan Illich for me teaches is that we spend a whole lot of time thinking about who we should vote for versus being prepared for the choice of voting. And that sounds like a nitpicky difference, but his idea is actually we would make better choices if we prepare for the experience of the choice, if we'd be preparing for the thinking more than spending all our time saying what's the right or wrong choice. Like there's a slight little difference between plan and prepare is the way I think about it. Who do you plan to vote for versus are you prepared for the voting? There's a difference there that actually I think gets in the right balance of philosophy and even economics for like Hume and the counter enlightenment and different things. It's like there's a lot of people that have ideas on how to make the world versus be prepared for the world making them and learning how to actually be open to it. And then I think that's an important distinction because like you say, oh, I'm tired and I'm not getting enough sleep. There's a time energy issue, as Dave will emphasize. And look, the other thing, to just go back to that Matthew 6, look at in that whole look at the birds of the air, there's a certain slow down, calm down, don't worry about it to it, right? And yet it's mystical, and yet it's also saying the most practical thing you can do is look to the birds of the air, right? So there's a way too where actually just being prepared for yourself in these things coming at you somehow can enhance one's capacity to relate to them rightly, and not maybe trying to be the philosopher king with the best ideas on how to make everything that can become totalitarian, right? So there's an interesting move there. It seems very hard as a human being to be prepared to receive life versus planning life away. And it seems it takes a lot of work to do that. More can be said, but let me give it to Philip.
One of the best ways to prepare for voting this is extremely biased because it's what I do to pay for my life, is I would encourage everyone to like work in finance for a couple of years. It is like radically changed like how I think about how things get done. If we are to talk about impactful action in, you can call it late stage corporate capital, you can call it techno feudalism, you can call it the American cyber empire, whatever you want to call it. Like, they get done with like contracts between like really, really big players. Some people would, venture to say that they're actually bigger than state governments, and more powerful than the people we're voting for. And what I admire, because I also work in theater, what I admire about the finance guys is like their attention is sick. Like that, they're pretty average in most all things of life, but when it comes to, I don't know, the bottom line, like they pull out some stops and they're just like, woo, like this is the greatest thing ever. I'm gonna get a bigger, bonus at the end of the year because I signed this deal. And like the inanity of it being like, what, you're gonna do this and like somehow feel better about your life, like you're gonna escape your death anxiety, you're gonna like potential problems. I don't know if that's even like something going on until they retire, because I've talked to a lot of people that retire and they're like, what was I doing? Like, what drug was I on? But I think this is like one of the question of scale. I think like this has to be thought with it, that there are like so many motherfuckers working so hard to, make calculations, make deals to continue 3% year-over-year GDP growth. And I just think that they're like, we're gonna do this hell or high water. And then you have like a bunch of different kind of bailout, like weird socialist help for people that make bad gambles that just like kind of keeps it going. So it's interesting to think like, how might the liminal web, what would it need to do in order to 10x its impactful activity in the real world? And I think on some level it'd be like super cool to hear some politician saying what we're saying. I think it'd be super cool to hear some, banker, to hear some, head of a giant asset management company saying what we're saying. I also am like nauseated by like, it would be like going against everything they're saying on some level. So yeah, that's I feel like an interesting paradox.
No, delightful. And yeah, a lot of people work very hard for that extra holiday fruitcake. I mean, there's nothing like getting 2 fruitcakes instead of 1. I mean, come on now. So it is the place. I'll give it to Javier and Michael. I mean, there's a few things. First off, what you're getting at, this is to me, and I think we've alluded to it before. If you say, well, we're going to beat them or we're going to outlaw, they're going to stop them. Well, they own K Street. They have the capital nation state. And actually, there's some arguments to be made that movement of capital can have a beneficial role. It just depends, right? That's where, to me, I'm extremely interested, like we were talking with Christian and even this, on what we have to, for me, a major step if we're talking spread is to a transformation of the medium condition of the classroom that is making people associate education, the capacity to do a conversation like this versus being good on a test, and also to help them move out of a paradigm of pragmatism to also including a value ethics. If you change that on the fundamental layer of values versus what do we outlaw, and you thus open avenues of the abstract social values by which people operate, then the issue now is we have economic competition, but not value competition as such, because you cannot do that where the classroom as a medium is making people subconsciously associate learning with memorization, which almost by definition has to reify the job market that is pre-existing, right? And then come what may, maybe that doesn't work, maybe it does, right? But certainly, if you say, well, people shouldn't be doing that, they shouldn't be working hard to get their fruitcake, well, now you're moralizing. Who are you? Are you what big other are you going to turn to say that, right? There's an issue there. You say, well, you're destroying the planet. Oh, some other guy is your big other? I don't care. How do you know, right? The complexity there. You can always play that game. So you have to open competition in the realm of ways of thinking, which to me, the liminal web is a social coordination mechanism to dialectically work with. The pricing mechanism can do reform to change the classroom, things like learning webs, decentralization of the classroom, movements toward oral tradition, which AI is going to help us with, and other things like that. I think colleges have a monopoly on credentials, and I think the monopoly of certification is also an issue, as we've talked about, and things of that nature. But I think it's a tremendous point. I think, like you said, like they focus really hard and they're going to get that freaking fruitcake, man. So how do we become better at moving between modes of focus that we can then hold in a profound way? I think is a great question, but let me give it to Javier, Michael, and then Thomas Jockin. And alas, I will have to run, but Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's this. I think what Philip is pointing out is really interesting because I feel like I'm on the opposite end when I volunteer at the homeless shelter. Like, but I see the opposite end where like these guys come in and man, they are so broken because not only do we always try to give them their stuff back, right? Get them signed up for new IDs, get them signed up for new birth certificates. But every couple of months they come back and they're like, dude, all my shit was stolen. All my shit was stolen. And I've noticed that it's a repetitive cycle. These guys are constantly going back to square one, constantly going back to square one. But what's really interesting is that I kind of love being around homeless people. And it's so weird because I think it's the first time where I'm not like super conscious of myself. Like I'm not thinking about how they're like judging me, you know, because they're like preoccupied with themselves about, you know, they need money, they're in their poverty, they're in their lack, you know. But this is not to say that we should have such a focus of being in our poverty, but I think it's analogous to the mystical journey of being in our poverty. And by being in our poverty, we're able to self-forget. And so I think that's such a radical perspective that religion has been pushing on. The problem is like what Philip was talking about, which is like when you think about massive scale, can we create like a mystical society? Well, there's a couple of problems. One, I think we've only had an ascetic mystical society. People like Thomas Merton's stuff were trying to push away from that. They started seeing towards the end, we need a more social, mystic, active situation. Nietzsche's critique was also about this, about a form of Christianity that was ascetic, that was pushing away from society, being away from men, people, Zarathustra. So there's a radical. I think religion needs to stay in place for sure. The thing is, I think because religion has that potential to do social formations, I think the potential is there if we can change the ideas and expression of religion in a creative, contemplative action kind of social role. Now, the other issue is, and this is what the mystics always say, is that we're sort of helpless and powerless when it comes to actually changing the course of history. Right, like the Abrahamic God perspective is God's grace comes in, right? So there is a certain sense in which we cannot be too preoccupied. I don't know, it's a difficult balance because it's not to say that we shouldn't care and we shouldn't think about it, but it's also to understand that when we do think about it, we have an utter poverty to actually make the moves that happen. But the mystical argument is that if you do the inner transformation, the potential is there for grace to come in, right? In your self-forgetting, the potential is there. And I think that's the strongest direction to take is that you can prepare yourself for a transparency of being by doing a kind of praxis despite the kind of hopeless and helpless ginormity of the situation that we are currently in. Because yeah, right, it's $1 million question to how do we even begin to have the conversation with people about how to change the whole social economic paradigm.
Magnificent. It seems as if what we can do is perhaps better coordinate the mystical and better coordinate beauty and better coordinate intrinsic motivation, but you cannot guarantee it. And in fact, actually, so it goes with wealth, actually. You can't even, we know that the pricing mechanism is an effective way to coordinate resources. At the time when it came about, we didn't know so much, right? And Adam Smith himself, when he talks about, there's actually, and Dietrich McCloskey stresses this, there's two invisible hands, not just one. There's the ethical, cultural invisible hand and the market invisible hand. Oh, and if you don't have the invisible hand of the market may get you killed. Adam Smith was not naive. He said there's an invisible hand for good or for bad. It depends on the second invisible hand of the ethics of the society, right? So the issue is the pricing coordination is a very effective means of coordinating resources and coordinating wealth, but it doesn't guarantee it. Oh, and what if you have a culture that doesn't value looking at trees? Well, then we chop them all down. Oh, well, that's a problem. So yeah, it's real good at coordinating your values, but your values may be suicidal. Shoot. But Adam Smith knew that. He stressed that. He was a tragic thinker. He was not a simple man. So likewise, I think things like the liminal web and et cetera that we've been showing, they can better coordinate social relations and better coordinate the experiences of beauty, but it cannot guarantee them. If it could guarantee them, they probably wouldn't be what they are, right? And so there's also the odd thing when Jesus is like, look at the birds of the air. He doesn't say, look at the birds of the air because you'll have a mystical experience. He's like, look at the birds of the air. That's also a funny thing when actually I think ethical imperatives are at their best. It's actually when a mystic is telling you to do something that has an authority as if it's just an ethical imperative you must. But the reason they're telling you is because there's a mystical end to it they can't say. Look at the birds of the air. Why? Look at the birds of the air. Okay, gosh, big other, I guess I will. Oh, Solomon in all of his glory. I always think that's how ethical imperative is supposed to be in the mystical sense, where they're telling you to do something. Look at a tree, not because you'll have a mystical experience, because the moment they tell you that, it like kills it for some reason, because you stop wrestling with it. The ethical imperative is supposed to be a mystical imperative in disguise. But unfortunately, after the Enlightenment, the ethical imperative became the ethical for the ethical sake, not a mystical imperative in an ethical imperative disguise, if you will, if that makes sense, right? That's the problem now, is our laws and our ethics are not beauty imperatives, love imperatives, and mystical imperatives in disguise. They are what they are. Just do it because I said so, right? Why? Well, for the power, right? So there's something there as well. Look at the birds of the air. It's an imperative that is in the form of a kind of ethical, but it's actually mystical in disguise, which the mystical must be or it doesn't work, right? So I think it actually goes with social coordination at its best. There's a coordination for the sake of community and social, and you don't add the part about mystical possibility, because if you add that, that ruins it, and there's an expectation that then removes the self-forgetfulness. It's like it's like having the intention of doing a jazz improvisation, which ruins it. So there's a need to create a condition and an action that doesn't have an idea of the end that then increase the probability of the blooming, right? So I think that's the kind of activity in wrestling that has to be done. But let me give it to Michael and then Mr. Jock. And Michael, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Good to see you as well, and good to see everyone here. Yeah, no, so much great stuff here. I was thinking about going back to Philip talking about finance bros. I was on a I was on a train coming back from San Francisco, and yeah, make it rain. And I was sitting in front of these two guys, and I think they were like data analysts for Google or something. And I was kind of just like overhearing their conversation, and it was like pretty, like I live in the Silicon Valley, so you hear a million of these types of conversations. And like I was like about to put my earphones in, and one of the guys was like talking about his experience working at Google. Like he doesn't work there now, and he was like, the reason I like the moment I got to like, oh, this is a job that like I'm not cut out for and I can't do, is when I realized that essentially they were paying me to be a fortune teller. Like they would give him like these, like 10-year projections of, Google's stock or like trends in the market. And they basically like asked him to, advise them on how to make financial decisions based on like, a line of best fit, projection of, okay, well, we've been here the last 5 years, so like this is where we'll probably be. And like these were like senior level executives who had been around the block in, the financial world, who were like so dead set on their belief. Like it sounded like they like really earnestly believed that they could like control like the outcomes of this like infinitely complex market. And yeah, I just like sometimes I think about that conversation and just laugh because like, like what we're doing here, and I feel like what the liminal web like kind of trains people is like the cultivation of like a certain like existential humility and like how to wade in like utter uncertainty. And what I think is like so much of like the game A world is like trying to, yeah, combat the actual fear and the actual reality that none of us really know what the fuck's going to happen tomorrow, by like just kind of going full tilt on projections and calculations and trying to control outcomes. And yeah, I think a problem of scaling something like the liminal web is that it seems like for something to really become scalable, it inevitably has to lose some of its complexity. Like to like mass produce something, if you think about like a food product that starts off as like a mom and pop shop, and it's like one or two people, they have all of these natural ingredients that they grow, and they like go through the process of making the thing. And then if you move on to that product being acquired by, a supermarket, it's like, if you really want to make a return on your investment, you're going to have to start to, really make those processes more efficient. And so, like something like what we're doing is like, how many people have time 3 hours on a Thursday to have a conversation about death anxiety and God and and so like the real struggle I think is like scaling the essence of this without losing the complexity, and because like to lose the complexity is to fall prey to projections and calculations and putting things in like clearly defined boxes, and yeah, and it's like I wonder if the goal should even be to scale it. Like should that even be the end goal? Because will that just kill it, like that's something that I've wondered, is like, we inevitably will talk about scaling, I feel like every net. And I don't know, I like I feel this like weird like protectiveness of like, and I think part of what makes this space so special is that it's small and intimate. But yeah, I'll give it back. Thank you.
No,
Thank you for the time.
magnificent. And I'm now, as you were speaking about the people in Google, I'm now thinking about the Miss Clio commercials. Miss Clio, ChatGPT, they missed the chat. Should have been Clio GPT. They really are missing an opportunity. And now I know that Miss Cleo, who did all those fortune telling and tarots in the 90s, is running Google. I always wondered where she ended up. Now we know. So that's delightful. And I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here. I think it's very important that you cannot make your intention to scale something. The name of the game for me is to remove the legal and certification barriers of which that restrict competition between different ways of socially and metaphysically judging reality. Right now, there's a monopoly of the commodity form for understanding reality according to the medium of the classroom, thus problem solving, not problem management. We have the utility way of interpreting reality, and all of the social order, because of its laws and certifications, makes that the only game in town. You should not say, let's scale something. What one should do is remove the barriers of access and competition so that people come into it at a natural rate where it spreads at a manner that actually is meeting the demand of people who move into it looking for it and who want it. Otherwise, it overfits. It becomes overly capital expenditure. It begins collapsing. It becomes a barrier, burnout and stuff like that, right? Like, what to me, it's almost like a Heideggerian clearing logic, is what you're thinking about: what laws, what financial practices, what notions of certification are actually getting in the way of people operating and thinking differently, according to different ways of thinking versus the commodity form or abstract social use, as Marx will talk about, or disablement, as Ivan Illich would say, or affliction, as Vey would say, or the left brain, as McGilchrist would say. Let's use McGilchrist. Basically, the society has restricted possibilities of competition socially, institutionally, between left and right brain. The left brain has a monopoly. Therefore, the only thing that scales is the left brain, because that's simply how the laws and structures of certification and things go, right? So if you are saying, wow, we need to more scale right brain activities to get a dialectic between left and right, well, what that is removing the barriers for the possibility of that competition. And the competition then allows consumers and individuals and agents to choose which one of those ways of seeing or operations or mental therapies, you could almost say, that they believe is fitting for them at the time, and then to create value and coordinate human action accordingly. So there's a way when you talk about the scaling problem as the intention to scale versus the removing of barriers so that there can be a natural spread, like a garden that grows because you give it more space by which to grow. Maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but you increase the possibility of more effective coordination of scaling by removing barriers as such, and monopolies on class. And this actually gets into things like architecture, human geometry, Chris Alexander, Pablo. Like, there's a way we design cities also tend to remove autocatalytic possibilities in favor of raw pragmatism and utility. So there's actually, Benita Roy talks a lot about architecture. I think the areas we have to think are law, architecture, mediums, spaces, to remove barriers that keep the mind from operating according to different meta apprehensions and judgments. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin, and then alas, I will have to run. But Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you. Are looking sharp. Look at that guy, Mr. Jockin.
So first of all, I want to point out on I'm always standing for beauty at all cases, all times. I want to point out where I am. I'm at the Chattahoochee River right now. And
oh my gosh. Oh yes. My gosh.
Got to tell you, it's been a solid 2 hours, a very solid, strong, magnificent 2 hours spending time talking to everybody.
Very nice
conversation. So hope everyone's doing well. All right. So what everyone's saying at the end, especially, but I want to tie into the beginning too, what Dimitri said when I came in. There's a concept in design called legibility, specifically the things that are perceptible. And what's traditionally that's always been in design been about formal visual appearance, meaning is the letter form clear to see. But legibility also has a dimension of normative standard, meaning what's legible to someone is based on the normative cultural context of the entity of the interacting with the object, its affordances. This absolutely applies to general categories of intelligibility. I think one of the members in the group made a comment about the election. Generally, what we do in things like the political act of voting, we have collapsed the higher dimensionality of the moral life down to basically a binary choice. It's A or B. And more importantly, that decision and choice is going to have is the moral act of cultivating one's life and our way of life and how we're going to shape ourselves. I'm not denying that it's not an aspect of the facts of the ground, but I want to point out that it's happening. And time again, all these examples everyone's been bringing up, Daniel, they've been bringing up the idea of architecture, the idea of basically utility, or even the finance bros. They all got measures of intelligence, what's legible to them. What's legible is what is clear and obvious to them. And actually, it's very interesting. Usually the measure of legibility is usually a description of fluency. Things that are legible, we gain very easy fluency. So when letters are legible, they're fluent to read. We don't struggle. We don't have any difficulty. We don't have confusion. But almost all those cases, it tends to require a very strong contrast move of distinction. And to do that move is a dimension reduction, generally, to make that happen. So as a result, what we end up doing is, and Daniel says many times before, basically, or interfacing of the dimensionality, high dimensionality of the person, of the soul, is to collapse it down to an interface of the market and whatever. Or in other examples, in health, for example. I mean, Daniel, two parts to that. One part is, you brought a very clear point of, I talked to my mother actually recently had some health issues where her back has some lower back pain. You know what's funny? She had a choice to go see either the physical therapist first or the pain management doctor first. I told her, you go to that physical therapist first, because I know, because the accounts is different. They're what's legible to them, what they study in the body and their interaction, their presumptions of response to the body are different. I say that because I want to be fair. Maybe not the case with maybe that particular doctor that when she goes to him for pain management or her. But the point is, like, the mode of intervention of a physical therapist would be investigating the muscle-skeletal nerve relationship and asking the question, what interventions in weight training or body movement or other intervention via those modalities can create healing, set up the conditions for healing. Because as you said it before, Daniel, it's absolutely true. Medicine has the presumption built in that its principle of health, which is its end goal, is reliant on the idea of healing, that the body heals. If the body does not heal, medicine can never do what it does in any of its modes, by the way, because generally medicine in its typical standing is either remove or privations. That's its general stance, with some exceptions. But even then, yes, because even like say amputation of a limb, it's still the idea of preserving health, because you're taking away a part of the body that's basically a privational state. It's going to kill the whole body. So this is all related to the legibility of the account. Your logos relates to what's legible to you and what's intelligible. And I bring this up because at the very beginning, because like Dimitri made a comment about your limit of reading and writing, I'm kind of surprised he didn't bring up speaking or teaching. That's actually a very important dynamic. I mean, Daniel, you brought it up yourself, that generally if you're in a impasse and one of the speaking, if you're impassive thinking, you probably need to go read. If you get an impasse, if you're too complex, you're too confused in your reading, you probably got to speak about it or write about it. You had a dichotomy relationship about it. I thought was quite good. It's those relationships, and let alone the idea of doing, God forbid. That's like, of course, there's always the next catch. So teaching does have that nice interfacing, right? Which is always why I'm very sympathetic to it, is that, there's a real standard demand put on you when you have to teach it to something else, because now it actually has to interface with someone else's model and account interfacing. That's on the conceptual level, let alone teaching how to do something. So that adds another level to it. And I said that especially because, I brought from the last net 2 notes on that. One, that the idea of what the philosopher is supposed to do is present images that can change your perspective and reference of what's legible to you, right? To kind of build on what we said last week. Because the idea, for example, Plato has noted of the hyponoia, right? So kind of the raising of understanding of the cave. That's one of his examples. It gets translated as allegory, but another way to take it is he presents this image of the cave, which is a certain. You can basically get a theme from that to kind of borrow from Luber's language about it, in the sense of don't be misled by the false flame, the false good. Aim for the higher good, right? That's the truth. So there's a diminished model, and the actual, which is much larger and more significant. That's one reading of the cave. There's multiple readings. That's the key. That's why it's a philosophical image, because it has multiple modes of reading. They are different different things are legible to different individuals about when you read the cave, based on your level of participation with it, understanding of it. And at least on one last note, and that relates to this question of scale in this group. For example, I wrote my Substack this weekend about it because I have this little group basically called the Friends of the Beautiful, come on those Discord on Sundays. And a member of it, his name is Harris. He took my philosophy, my Halcyon class on Plato and Beauty. He mentioned to me a statement I made in this set in that I had no recollection about. Zero. I had no clue. Wrote about it. I was dumbstruck. I was like, "What did I say, Harris?" He sent me a clip of it from YouTube. So I got recollected, and I made a comment. I basically my Substack post was, "There's a condition here, especially because I come from a very different divergent model background than everybody else in this group, and I do that, and that's with intention. So as a result, I'm sitting here kind of absorbing the models of everybody else here. And then from there, I then draw out some understanding that I don't come in pre-baked, ready to go. That I think that experience last week was so powerful because I forgot. It came out of me. And I'm like, that's cool. It wasn't even mine. It was just like out of it. It is the circumstance that generated it out of me. But via the technologies of the net, it allowed it to scale on two grounds. On one, so that Harris saw it afterwards, and then Harris used YouTube's technology to clip it and send it back to me, and then I wrote about it, and now we're doing like this meta like scale emphasis about it. It's very interesting. And I think in general, most of the digital scale stuff's going to operate that way. Because I remember actually when I jumped in with Michelle's point about interfacing with the Amazon shipping of the clothing versus going to the local organics, like the thrift store or the organic farmer, those are modes of discourse, like modes of interaction. Probably with the internet in this current era, it's going to be interfacing of these different levels of scale, right? That there are these intimate small scales that allow rapid trust, but then are mediated through technology apparatuses that allow this to be synchronized together, and then are used to then create this emanation scale. Basically, I think that's the point. Anyone on YouTube can come in and watch this. This view counter is pretty small. But who's to say? Who's to say it doesn't change in about 10 years if this keeps up? You'd be surprised what happens with consistency with online stuff, which is generally, probably, in my opinion, the secret weapon of the online space is the consistency. Being consistent to do something every single time at a certain cadence and to do it regularly forever and ever, or very long durations, is what generates character. And that generation of character actually emanates basically something that pierces through existence, especially in digital space. Generally, the ones who win are the most consistent. It's funny how that works. So actually, certain virtues that were kind of hidden in the past get more emphasized in this environment. I have other notes on other topics, but I've been talking too long, Dan. I want to be respectful of your time. But on a thorough way, I've been definitely sitting about modes of being, like ways of life, bio, from Aristotle, and specifically tying in with temperaments of the human character. Mainly because of what Daniel, you commented before, there's the great gap or chasm is between the definition of the secondary substance and the definiteness of the primary substance. And an understanding of bios from Aristotle of habitat and our way of, and basically the physis nature of a thing is in their environment interactions with it, which has to correspond, like basically has built within it the hypothetical and material necessity built within it, that your definition of your character is articulated through your way of living your life through the progression of life. There's lots of other notes related to the temperaments from Catholicism, as well as timbre in music. Again, I apologize. This is a huge topic, so I'm just thinking about this because the great issue in philosophy, from my point of view, is that problem of how does one live the excellent life, qua Thomas Yock and qua Daniel Gardner, right, or everybody else in this room. It's one thing to ask that question in the secondary substance of what does it mean to be an excellent man, to be in virtue in the man, or qua writer, or qua architect, or qua artist, or as philosopher, right? It's a whole other question to ask that question on the particular hexity of the individual substance, the Thomas Jockin question. And I feel like these questions of bios, way of life, habitat, the hypothetic and material necessity that respond to particular patterns in time, is probably the way that we address that. But that's a big topic. But it does relate to this idea of what's the intelligibility and the collapse of it. via the accounts provided, and that beauty would probably be the ultimate level of an inverse of that. But the philosopher has a role to play in presenting basically the hypnoia images that help us draw out potential new legibility, like what's legible in our experiences in life. Okay, that's all I got.
Magnificent. And your mom needs to see Seth. This is perfect because he's all in on that, right? So, you know, there we go. What you said was fantastic. And alas, because of the tyranny of work and obligations, I will run here. What you just said was very important. The likelihood of us realizing the fullness of radical particularity as Daniel is far less without a social coordinating mechanism that would increase the probability of that realization. So most like in the same way that the likelihood of the effective coordination of resources in a manner that did not lead to unintentional consequences before the pricing mechanism was low. Likewise, before a social coordinating mechanism, the probability has been low. The ways we've mostly done it is with colleges, centers of geographical influence, but they're stuck in a geography, and there also has not been a way to socially coordinate lower, middle, and upper government, politics, governance, or things. They've been organized by basically money or law or agenda. But all of that is within a certain social framework of legibility or understanding reality, so it has not opened up competitions of different ways of seeing the world, different kinds of legibility. All of that has assumed a legibility. Well, now the problem is the legibility itself, because what ends up happening is when you see reality simply according to the economic utility form, you lose the beautiful. When you lose the beautiful, you have a meaning crisis, you have a motivation crisis, you have the great stagnation, you have the collapsing of wealth, and so on and so forth. So the monopoly of a certain way of eligibility is the problem, which means, like you were saying with the allegory, a philosophical image has many forms of legibility. How do we make that tree to the average person have many forms of legibility? How does everything become a philosophical image, right? If you could do that, then you would not be locked into a single way of seeing reality, if you grant me that. And basically the issue to the flattening of the human being out of their fullness is getting stuck in a single way of seeing things, which then we form a habitat or an environment according to that one way of seeing that then we get in a feedback loop of ever reifying it. And that's the Simone Weil affliction. You're then entrapped in yourself. And when you're entrapped in yourself, you necessarily experience that as not being entrapped. It's all there is. And so what you have to have is a competition of ways of seeing things, different legibilities, which we haven't had because we haven't had a social coordination system for that competition. As a result, you're stuck in a single legibility, and social coordination has been according to that legibility, which worked until it didn't, and it's not. And so you have time energy problems, you have wealth problems, you have collapsing wages as profits go up. You have, obviously, Dugan. You have neoliberalism, a single way, and then, of course, Nick Land, right? Because all of those are a result of a single legibility, which also means you can't lead AI because the legibility according to which you see everything is precisely the same as AI at this point. And so it's going to do it better, and so you're kicked out. So the ability of regaining fullness is quite important. And then to the point of scale, basically, the liminal web is a thing that in of itself scales. It is a scaling thing. You don't have to make an intention to scale it or spread it. Like a garden, you don't have to intend for a garden to grow. A garden is a thing that grows if you create the conditions. Like you're saying, your student can send it back. Like all of this liminal YouTube, Zoom video recordings is a spreading phenomenon. The question is the barriers to the spread and the consistency for the spread. A garden is a thing of barriers and consistency, right? A garden, if the seeds are there, it grows, right? It's not intending it to grow. It's creating the conditions of the growth, okay? Well, that is a matter of you consistently water it, you consistently weed it, you consistently tend to it, and you create the space so that it can grow, right? So the question is the liminal web that? I think it is. So then what are the legal barriers that keep that from growing? And then, of course, there's sociological precedents from it, from the work of James Hunter in his book, To Change the World, that basically shows what does change the world is a faithful presence, not an intention to change the world, but a faithful presence, typically near places of influence, like the Bloomsbury Group is near Cambridge, but it's not in Greenville. That's very important. a lot of these big communities that have a big impact are coordinated together because of a place like Oxford, but then meet outside of the bureaucracy. And then there's a faithful presence to that in a network effect. We've now democratized the social coordinating mechanism to the liminal web, so we can do that and then also still have connections with the wider world or places of influence because you have the internet. You can say it's been diluted, sure, but I think that it's become more effective. And so the effectiveness makes up for the delusion. So there's also sociological accounts of this. That's simply a matter of removing barriers so you can increase competitions of modes of legibility. And I would say the mystic, to spread mysticism, is ultimately to spread the capacity for multiple forms of legibility. It is the ability to move between frameworks, and that's framework competition, and that makes it auto-catalytic, as Stuart Kaufman says, which means you can get emergent results from your variance of perspectives that you couldn't get otherwise, but you need that diversity to get that growth. The diversity creates the human growth. We need a human geometry in cities is what we also need in our own minds. But that's going to require us to see the whole human body as thinking, not just the brain, and to think together in communities like this, and to gather today on a beautiful day where we can look at that beautiful tree. It neither soils nor weeps nor stores up in barn like the other birds, and that wonderful lake that Mr. Jockin is enjoying at the hammock. I've enjoyed it tremendously, everyone. Seth, thank you for being here, sir. Javier, Mr. Jockin, Philip, it is always a treat. Thank you all. Have a wonderful one. Thank you.